Hi everybody, today we are going to look at some acrylics techniques to improve our acrylics painting. In order to do this, you're going to need a piece of watercolor paper, a thick one will be best, some masking tape, some water, of course a bigger bucket of water and a smaller cup, the big one for the dirty brushes and the smaller one for the cleaner. Also going to need some paintbrushes, round and filbert or flat. You are going to need your palette, and of course you're going to need some paint. I am going to get myself some primary colors, but you can use whatever colors you want really, but you do need to get a white and a black for your tints and shades. Further to that, we're going to get some cling film, a palette knife, and also a sponge. You can just get a sponge from the kitchen and cut a little area of it. Make sure you cut an area that's quite rounded, as it will help you with your techniques later. So here you go. The very first thing I'm going to do is prepare the area of work. I am right-handed, so my water is going to be on the right-hand side, and I'm going to get quite a lot of tissue paper. After I do that, I'm going to create my grid. Now, with my masking tape, I'm going to create a frame around my paper just to make it a little bit prettier, and then a 4x3 grid. So let's do it. I'm going to get my masking tape. Of course, if it's too sticky, make sure that you put it on your clothes first. And very carefully create your grid. For our first area, I'm going to get a little bit of red paint. I will wet my paintbrush a little bit, take the excess off of course on the tissue, and I'm going to homogeneously cover my paintbrush on the palette. After I do that, and I've got no blobs, I am just going to go up and down on the paper quite quickly. Don't try to just pull the paint from one side to the other, just go up and down and it will help it to become much more homogeneous. Now, I decided to use this color to show you what it looks like on the first layer, because this is a very see-through color. We're going to have to leave it for a while and we'll come back to it later to make it nice and solid. On the second one, I'm actually going to create a gradient. So again, wet your paintbrush. Take a good bit of paint and paint the top of the square. Make sure that it's nice and solid and smooth. Then I'm going to get a little bit more paint because now I have a good background. I can wet my paint a little bit more. Clean your paintbrush, and once you have it nice and clean, you are going to start pulling that paint down. Once you're getting to an area where you see that it's going to just pull the whole paint down, clean it again. And again, you're going to go from the area that you painted before, not right from the top, just to pull a little bit more down as well. And what this is going to do is create a sense of gradient. For the third one, I am going to show some tints and shades. First off, I'm going to apply my main color in the middle. And without putting much water and without cleaning my paintbrush, I am going to apply the black to the top, pulling it down to start blending with the blue. I'm going to clean my paintbrush, this time quite thoroughly, because next I want to use the white. And I'm going to just try to blend it a little bit more so that it's a little bit more homogeneous. Now clean your paintbrush quite thoroughly, apply the white and work your way up so that it meets with the blue. Once you do, try to go from one side to the other to create a nice gradient. You'll notice that I go up a little bit more and then I clean my paintbrush again so that I'm not pulling a lot of the blue down. Basically, every time that you're going from a darker color to a lighter color, clean your paintbrush quite thoroughly. If you're going from a light one to a dark one, you don't have to be as careful with it. Once I'm happy with that blending, it is time to go back to my first square. It should be fairly dry by now. So, on a different direction than I was going before, this time I don't need to apply as much water because I have a good background there. And I'm just going to paint all throughout that square to make a solid color. That looks pretty good to me. On the next square, I'm going to show you how to blend two different colors. I'm going to use my yellow my lightest color, and apply it up to 2/3 of this square. Then clean your paintbrush nicely, grab some blue or whatever color you're using, and you're going from the top down. You're going to overlap the blue and the yellow a fair bit. And again, if you're going from a dark color to a light color, clean your paintbrush quite thoroughly so that you don't mix them too much. This is going to take you a couple of different layers. This is completely normal in acrylics. Layers will always help your colors look brighter, more vibrant, and more full. On the next square, we are going to try and do a wet on wet. But this time, not only the paint is going to be wet, you are also going to create a wash on the paper to give it more of a watercolory feel. So if you create a layer of water just to dampen the paper, and you take a little bit of paint and add it onto it, you will notice that the colors are going to be much smoother, but also that you're not going to be able to see the brush strokes as much. You can nearly create a painting that basically just looks like watercolor using this technique. Adding water to the paint, adding water to the paper. So remember, every time that I'm going from the red to the blue, I'm going to clean my paintbrush, and same thing the other way around. In this technique, you need to let the colors do their thing a little bit, just like you would with watercolor, as this creates the best possible blending. On this next square, let's try two different techniques used by artists like Seurat and Monet. The first one is going to be Pointillism, in which you just add little dabs of paint to the paper in order to create the illusion of color blending and illusion of shape. So I'm going to use these little dots of purple and then use some blue, and I'm just going to overlap them slightly, but mainly putting them between each other. When I get to the top, I'm going to use a much more impressionistic technique, which is to use very quick brush strokes to create blending. So again, you are not going to try and blend the colors directly. Instead, you are going to just overlap them and hope that they blend nicely. Those little areas of red, I don't want to blend them too much. I want there to be quite a lot of texture. This technique is all about having a little bit of texture on your painting. So don't try to be too particular, or you'll just end up with a smooth blend. Now for the next square, make sure that you wet your paintbrush, but then take as much of the water off as possible. You want to have it quite dry because we're going to create some dry brushing. In order to do this, get your paintbrush as dry as possible, grab a little bit of the paint, and just start applying the color. You will start by applying paint that is very textured, and you'll still be able to see quite a lot of the background, but it's all about adding layers and building that color up. The way that I like using this technique is by having a blend that is not smooth. You can still see the colors going into each other. They don't smoothly blend with each other, but it creates a more textured blend for sure. You can also use this for textures like fur and tree bark, hair, anything that you want. Creating a glaze is much easier with acrylics than it is with watercolors. The reason for this is that it doesn't matter how much you paint with the acrylics, the colors underneath are not going to lift, because once the acrylics set, they become waterproof. Personally, with a paint like this that is very matte, I prefer to add a little bit of water just because I find it more satisfying to paint with acrylics that are a little bit more diluted. Look how smooth it is when I try to do these little waves. So you can do any object that you want, any shape that you want. Just make sure that you leave some white areas for the glazing to show through. For the next one, you need to assault your kitchen and get yourself some cling film. A little bit like this will be absolutely perfect. To create this technique, we are actually going to do it in 2 goes, but for the first go, apply a fair amount of paint don't try to blend it too smoothly. It will look much better if you don't. As soon as you've done that, and of course don't let them dry, just apply the cling film on top and use your fingers to create the texture that you like. This is not going to be like watercolor, where some areas are going to be very light and others very dark. Instead, it's going to give you a more textured feel. We're going to continue on a couple more squares and then we'll come back to it once it had a little bit of time to set, but it's not completely dry. Next, let's try to use some sponges. Draw a line right in the middle. This is going to show the area that is a wet sponge and a dry sponge. For the first one, you're just going to get a dry sponge, get a little bit of paint and start dabbing down. Don't try to brush the paint onto the paper, it won't work as well. You're going to have to build it up quite slowly, and what you'll actually create is a fairly smooth layer of paint. The more you dab, the smoother the blending will become, and you can use, again, any colors that you like. It really does not matter whatsoever. Once you've completed this area, you're going to wet your sponge a little bit, not too much. Again, add a little bit of paint to it and start dabbing. What you will notice is that the colors will start blending much better to begin with, but actually it'll be much more noticeable, the texture, the more you work with it. And that's because the water is going to create little bubbles that we'll see through once everything is dry. Now it's time to take the cling film off, and we will go back and work on it a little bit later once the paint is dry. So whilst we wait, let's get our old toothbrush and create some splatters. On one area, I left it a little bit more wet than the other, and in fact, to begin with, I probably exaggerated in the water, so I had to clean up certain areas there. Again, you'll notice that when the paintbrush is a little bit more wet, the blobs of paint, the splatters will be much thicker, much bigger. When the paintbrush is dry, the splatters will be much smaller and create a much more homogeneous texture. Finally, let's get our palette knife and get a little bit of paint. You will notice that I am putting my paint on the lower side of the palette knife, not on the top. We're not trying to actually eat the paint and using it as a spoon. So the way you paint it is just to apply the paint down and you drag. You grab a different color, you apply it down and you drag. You need to make sure that you have enough paint. Basically, if you can feel the paper, you're doing it wrong. The idea of this is just to apply the paint down on the paper and drag the paint. You're not supposed to be brushing the paper at all. On this particular one, we're going to create a gradient that goes from red to yellow to white. Whenever I need to clean my palette knife, all I need to do is grab a piece of tissue and clean it through. There's no need for you to get water on it. Unless, of course, you let the paint dry, which should never happen. Going back to our cling film texture, I am now going to use some white because I want you to see clearly what it can look like once you actually add different layers to it. Again, leave the cling film down for a little bit so it can set, but not dry completely. Going back to our glazing, all the first layer is completely dry now, so I can very safely and easily do my second glazing layer. To make a second glazing layer, you should be diluting your paint and slowly brushing it on top of the other one. This is a particularly good technique if you have done a painting and then you realize that the tone of the painting, the atmosphere is not quite right. So in order to lighten a painting up, I might glaze some areas in yellow, or to dull it down, make it more dreamy, I can glaze some areas in blue or purple. So it just adjusts the tone of your painting, almost as if it was a Photoshop filter. So now it's time to take the cling film off and reveal the texture that we got underneath. I really like this technique. It makes it fun and quite grungy. Now it's time to take the masking tape off and reveal the lighter areas in which we can write the name of each of the techniques we tried on today. So very slowly, remember not to just pull it completely, as you might damage your paper. Creating sheets like this is a great way for you to have a piece of paper where you can try lots of different techniques without the pressure of having to make a previously drawn picture look good. This way you can just try them up and have it almost like a lookup sheet to remind yourself of techniques when you are doing your own painting. Need to remind yourself of some techniques, you need a refresh on textures, or even some ideas on how to create a background or a specific texture, you have it right here. I truly hope that this has helped you with your work, and I cannot wait to see the paintings that you do next. So thank you for watching and good luck!